The year was 1943. The ruins of Stalingrad still smoldered, filled with frozen corpses, twisted tank wreckage, and ghosts that seemed to whisper among the rubble. The whole world had watched the impossible happen, the mighty German war machine, which for years crushed everything under its caterpillars, had been defeated, and not just anywhere, but in the heart of the Soviet Union, in the city that bore Stalin's own name. When the German Sixth Army, under General Paulus, was surrounded and annihilated, it was as if the ground had shaken in Berlin. For the first time, the myth of Nazi invincibility had been shattered. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers lay dead or captured, and Soviet propaganda now echoed across the front. Stalingrad was the tomb of the fascists. The Red Army, now fueled by this colossal victory, advanced with renewed fury. The morale of the Soviet soldiers was soaring. Every step westward was like a step of revenge for their dead brothers, for their burned villages, for their raped mothers, for their hanged sons. The war for them was no longer just political. It was personal, animal, bloodthirsty. About that, the Germans staggered like a wounded boxer. They were being pushed back in a long line of retreat, barely able to regroup. On the map, the Wehrmacht seemed to be falling apart, exhausted troops, without supplies, frozen to the bone. Entire divisions decimated. A sense of defeat permeated the faces of the soldiers who, months before, had marched arrogantly across the steppes. But the Soviet winter was treacherous, and the German high command, even wounded, still breathing. There were still wolf-eyed generals, cold and methodical strategists, and soldiers hardened by years of blood and mud. Amidst the chaos, one name began to loom like a shadow: Manstein. And as the Soviets confidently advanced into Ukraine, taking city after city, they didn't know they were walking straight into a trap. Snow covered the fields like a white blanket. But beneath that icy silence, death was preparing its return. The Soviet offensive advances like an avalanche, the wind cut like blades. The sky was a dull, heavy, colorless gray, as if even the sun was exhausted from that war. And beneath this icy darkness, Soviet forces came in droves, like an avalanche that could not be stopped. It was February 1943. After the roar of victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet generals knew that this was the time to crush the Germans. The Red Army wasn't just on the march, it was on the rampage. They knew that every kilometer recovered was another wound to Hitler's pride. T-34 tanks tore through the snow with ferocity. Thousands of infantry marched in compact columns, while mobile artillery advanced through the frozen craters in the ground. It was a human wall of soldiers determined to drive the Nazis from their lands, a brutal and rapid advance, driven by accumulated hatred and hope reborn. The Voronezh Front and the Southwestern Front, sob commando de Vatutin A. Golikov, pushed the Germans with an almost blind force in an offensive that seemed endless. Hitler's troops retreated, not for strategy, but for survival. Entire German divisions were being torn apart. The fighting raged, day and night, without respite. It was as if the ground was starving for blood, and winter served as a cruel stage where death danced relentlessly. Village after village was retaken. In each, starving civilians emerged from the rubble to see, for the first time in years, the red-starred soldiers bringing something resembling freedom. But freedom came with fire, the fighting on the back roads, in the frozen forests, and in the open fields was a festival of destruction. Grenades exploding inside trenches, flamethrowers devouring enemy positions, men howling in Russian, German, Ukrainian, and dying in different languages under the same ice. The city of Kursk, it fell. Belgorod was abandoned by the Germans, and the next jewel on the map was Kharkov, the second largest city in Ukraine, a vital strategic point for controlling the region. Hitler was furious, but the chaos on their front line was undeniable. The Soviets had advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks. It seemed that the Reich was crumbling. But in the midst of that desperate retreat, something strange started to happen. The Germans were leaving cities, yes, but in silence. They weren't fighting to the end. They weren't dying like cornered dogs. They were retreating in an orderly fashion, methodically, as if they were expecting something. And while the Soviets celebrated each victory, they didn't realize they were stretching themselves too thin. Supply lines stretched, troops tired, armored vehicles operating at their limit. The Soviet avalanche had been powerful, yes, but now it was beginning to spread, to lose strength. And deep down, very deep down, a lethal counterattack was beginning to take shape. Kharkov is liberated, or taken, February 16th, 1943. The sky was still heavy, grey as lead. The streets of Kharkov trembled with the roar of T-34 tanks, while Soviet infantry, knee-deep in ice and mud, advanced through the city's rubble. Kharkov had fallen, or better, had been retaken by the Soviets. Red troops raised flags in the squares, stuck bayonets in the ground, and shouted victory amidst the smoking rubble. Another city liberated from Nazi rule, another open wound on the Eastern Front being closed with blood. But there was something strange about that victory. There was no fierce resistance. The Germans had simply retreated. They left the city without the same desperation as other retreats. No siege, no house-to-house fighting, no last man standing, just abandonment. Kharkov was then liberated, but by force. The Soviets found it devastated, destroyed, and too empty. It looked like a gift left behind, a dangerous gift, a poisoned gift. In the city's underground, the silence was absolute. No Germans, no mines, no surprise shots. The Russian soldiers looked at each other. Some laughed, others trembled, and the more experienced ones were suspicious. After all, since when did Nazis abandon a position without taking the enemy's soul with them? Even so, the Soviet High Command decided to consolidate the victory. Reinforcements were deployed, tanks organized, and command posts established. The hammer and sickle flag flew proudly over the Central Committee building. The city was now red again, but behind the front line, Soviet generals began to argue. Many said the advance had been too rapid, that the lines were stretched, that artillery was falling behind, that the troops were exhausted. But Moscow's orders were clear: keep advancing, crush the Germans. Meanwhile, at the Army Group South headquarters, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein watched the map with cold, calculating eyes. Kharkov's silence was part of his plan. He was about to turn this Soviet victory into a trap of monstrous proportions. Kharkov had not been taken. It had been surrendered. And on the flanks of the city, where the Soviets barely had time to dig trenches, the storm was beginning to form. Because while the soldiers celebrated in the destroyed streets, the German panzers were already on the move. Manstein sets the trap. While the Soviets celebrated in Kharkov, unaware that they had overextended their lines and their luck, Erich von Manstein watched everything from German headquarters like a chess player facing an euphoric opponent. For many German generals, the war seemed lost. The defeats at Stalingrad and the Caucasus had crushed the Wehrmacht's morale. But Manstein here was not just any general. He was a rare strategist, cold, calculating, and ruthless. A man who saw the battlefield as a brutal game board. Unlike Hitler, who acted on impulse and pride, Manstein thought in terms of advantage, time, and decoys, and Kharkov was exactly that. Perfect bait. He knew the Soviets were intoxicated by victory. They had advanced too far, opening vulnerable flanks and creating gaps between their units. They were confident, perhaps too confident, and overconfidence on the Eastern Front was an invitation to slaughter. With surgical precision, Manstein began to set his trap. He gathered what remained of the German mobile forces in the region, the surviving panzer divisions, cold-hardened SS units, and all the tanks that could still walk, fire, or simply instill fear. Among them, the elite stood out, as Divisions Panzer der Waffen SS, Totenkopf, das Reich Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler. These were no ordinary divisions. They were fanatical, brutal elite troops, known as much for their effectiveness in the field as for their savagery. They had lost comrades at Stalingrad, and they wanted revenge. Manstein drew up a simple yet bold plan, would simulate total weakness in the center while concentrating strength on the flanks. He would let the Soviets believe that the Wehrmacht was in disorganized retreat, giving ground, but at the right moment would counterattack with maximum force in a crushing pincer movement. It was the classic sickle blow, now in the hands of those who had suffered it before. The Marshal knew he had a unique opportunity. Temperatures were below 20 degrees C. The roads were icy but passable, and the German tanks, though outnumbered, were still technologically superior, especially the feared Tigers and the versatile Panzer IV. The troops began moving silently along the icy roads. Steel columns advanced in the shadows, covered with branches and tarps to deceive Soviet aircraft. The roar of engines mingled with the wind. The soldiers, silent, sank their feet into the snow like predators before a leap. The trap was ready, and when it was activated, Kharkov would cease to be a victory and would become a slaughterhouse. The arrival of the SS Panzer, death in steel. The snow didn't hide the sound. Even from miles away, the roar of armored engines rent the icy silence like metallic thunder. It was as if winter itself were announcing that death was coming, not on foot but on steel tracks. They arrived. The panzer divisions of the Waffen-SS appeared on the German lines like ghosts from hell. Death's Head, the Reich, Leibstandarte, Adolf Hitler. Three names that inspired panic even among veteran Red Army soldiers, not only for their effectiveness in combat, but for the brutality with which they eliminated their enemies. They took no prisoners. These elite troops were different, better armed, better trained, more loyal to Nazi fanaticism. They wore black uniforms with the feared SS runes on their helmets. Each battalion was a precision machine of destruction, each platoon a sharp blade waiting for the command to cut, and the tanks were monsters. Panzer followed the columns, versatile and swift. But the real terror came right behind. The Tigers, 60-ton giants armed with 80mm guns capable of piercing a T-34 from 2 kilometers away. Each Tiger was like a castle on tracks, slow but indestructible. It was pure steel, pure fury, pure hate. Soviet troops guarding the flanks began reporting strange movements, German columns appearing where they shouldn't have been. But the Soviet command, convinced of victory, ignored the warnings. They thought the Germans were retreating. Little did they know that death was just changing positions. In frozen forests, the panzers were awaiting orders, with engines purring, steaming like bulls before a charge. Self-propelled artillery was positioned with precision. Reconnaissance units scanned the terrain like unseen predators. Manstein tightened the siege, little by little, like a hunter luring his prey into the center of a trap. And when the Soviet troops realized they were surrounded, it was too late. The roar of the tanks echoed across the tundra like steel thunder. Panzers advancing at speed, firing at every curve, every intersection, every enemy position that got in the way. The Wehrmacht was not dead, it was starving. The Red Army, caught by surprise, began to crumble. The Soviet front crumbled like thin ice under the weight of an elephant, and the soldiers who had previously celebrated in Kharkov, now they ran, screamed, burned alive inside the stricken T-34s. The war had changed its face. Again, and that face now was that off-tanks with black crosses and skulls on their chests. The false retreat, Manstein's hook, a symphony of blood and ice. Introduction: the winter of Soviet illusion. The year 1943 dawned over the frozen steppes of Eastern Europe with the promise of a decisive turning point in World War II. The Battle of Stalingrad, an epic of suffering and endurance, had culminated in the annihilation of the German Sixth Army, a devastating blow that resonated throughout the world. For the Soviet Union, The victory at Stalingrad was not just a military triumph, it was validation of its resilience, irrefutable proof that the Wehrmacht, previously invincible, could be broken. A wave of optimism, almost euphoric, swept the Soviet command and the ranks of its armies. It was believed, with almost religious conviction, that the enemy was collapsing, that the Nazi war machine was finally disintegrating under the weight of the Russian winter and Soviet determination. As the snow continued to fall silently, covering the frozen corpses and abandoned trenches, transforming the landscape into a white, macabre shroud, the Red Army soldiers marched westward, driven by an almost messianic fervor. Every city recaptured, every village liberated, every position that seemed to have been abandoned by the Germans. It fueled the illusion that the enemy was in disarray, on the verge of total collapse. Soviet propaganda echoed this belief, painting a picture of an exhausted, demoralized and fleeing Wehrmacht. The Soviet High Command, seduced by this narrative of imminent victory, began planning ambitious offensives aimed at the complete annihilation of the remaining German forces in southern Russia. But, as history would later prove, nothing was as it seemed. The apparent German disarray was, in fact, a meticulous orchestration, a macabre ballet of retreat and attraction. The German retreat was not a sign of weakness, but rather the manifestation of a brilliant strategic mind, weaving a trap with the coolness and precision of a surgeon. The stage was set for one of the most audacious and brutal counterattacks of World War II, a maneuver that would become known as Manstein's hook. The mind of Manstein, the architect of the death trap in the maelstrom of despair and chaos that followed the catastrophe of Stalingrad, as the Third Reich reeled under the weight of its losses and German troop morale plummeted, the figure of Erich von Manstein emerged. Considered by many military historians to be one of the Wehrmacht's most brilliant strategists, Manstein was no ordinary general. His mind was a labyrinth of innovative tactics and calculated audacity, capable of seeing opportunity where others saw only ruin. He possessed a rare combination of brutal pragmatism and tactical genius, qualities that would be put to the ultimate test on the frozen battlefields of the East. While Hitler, in his delirium of omnipotence, insisted on holding indefensible positions and forbade any retreat, Manstein understood the harsh reality of the situation. The southern front was in tatters, supply lines stretched to the limit, and the German divisions, exhausted and decimated, were on the verge of collapse. A strategic withdrawal, though painful, was imperative to save what remained of Army Group Don and avoid an even greater catastrophe. But Manstein would not be content with a simple retreat. He saw in the Soviet voracity for advance an opportunity, a weak point to be exploited. It was in this desperate scenario that Manstein devised his tactical masterpiece, a perfect trap, a plan that would transform apparent defeat into a bloody victory. His vision was that of a patient fisherman who, instead of fighting the fish's strength, skillfully guides it into the net. The bait would be the German retreat itself, a retreat that, to Soviet eyes, would appear to be a disorderly escape, but which in reality would be a calculated move to lure the enemy into a position of extreme vulnerability. The hook, invisible and sharp, was already being prepared. Manstein's plan was complex and demanded iron discipline from the German troops. It involved a coordinated retreat, but one that simulated disorganization to encourage the Soviet advance. The German units were supposed to withdraw, yes, but not in panic. Every step back would be a step into the trap. The idea was to stretch Soviet supply lines, expose their flanks, and, crucially, lure their armored formations to terrain where the German forces, though outnumbered, could deliver a decisive blow. It was a chess game on a monumental scale, where every piece moved had a deadly purpose. Manstein, with his sharp mind, already saw checkmate approaching, while the Soviets, intoxicated by the illusion of victory, marched blindly toward their bloody fate. the bait, the calculated retreat, and the dance of death. Manstein's execution of false retreat was a masterpiece of deception and military discipline. While Soviet generals like Golikov saw only disorder and flight, what unfolded on the battlefield was a meticulously planned tactical retreat. The German divisions, though exhausted and battered, executed the maneuver with almost robotic precision, a testament to the Wehrmacht's iron discipline even under the most adverse conditions. It was not a rout, but a controlled retreat, a step back that was actually a step forward in Manstein's plan. The center of the German line was indeed retreating, but with exemplary discipline. There was no panic, only the execution of precise orders. Units disengaged from combat in an orderly fashion, destroying bridges, depots, and infrastructure to hinder the Soviet advance, but without leaving behind valuable equipment that could be used by the enemy. This retreat, though slow and methodical, was designed to drive the Soviets, like starving cattle, into a narrow valley, a natural trap that Manstein had identified as the ideal location for his attack. As the center retreated, the flanks of the German pincer closed in. The SS and Wehrmacht Panzers, elite units that had been spared the attrition of Stalingrad or had been quickly re-equipped, were already in position. They were not retreating. They were waiting. Like the sharp fangs of a predator waiting for the exact moment to pounce, these tanks and their mechanized infantry formations camouflaged themselves in the winter landscape, waiting for the signal to attack. The snow, which had previously seemed an implacable enemy to the Germans, now became their ally, providing cover and concealment for their maneuvers. Manstein had studied his enemy's psychology. He knew that after the victory at Stalingrad, the Soviet command would be prone to arrogance and underestimation. The rush to exploit what appeared to be a German retreat would be irresistible, and that's exactly what happened. The Soviets, intoxicated by the advance, didn't realize they were being led into a trap. Every kilometer gained was a step deeper into the abyss Manstein had dug for them. The bait had been swallowed, and the hook was firmly set. As the German units retreated, they left behind just enough to maintain the illusion of a disorderly retreat. Damaged equipment, abandoned vehicles, but nothing that could alert the Soviets to the true nature of the maneuver. The desolate, snow-covered landscape contributed to the farce, masking the movements of the German forces as they positioned themselves for the counterattack. It was a large-scale theater of war, where life and death were the main actors, and Manstein, the ruthless director, orchestrated each scene with diabolical mastery. The trap was almost complete, and the fate of thousands of Soviet soldiers was sealed in the ice and snow of the Russian winter. The Soviet advance, the intoxication of victory, and the march into the abyss. While the Wehrmacht executed its calculated retreat, the Soviet armies, driven by the euphoria of victory at Stalingrad and the belief that the German war machine was collapsing, advanced with a speed and confidence bordering on recklessness. With each kilometer conquered, with each city liberated, the sense of triumph deepened, blinding the Soviet high command to the dangers gathering on their flanks and rear. They believed they were pursuing an enemy in disarray, when in fact they were being skillfully lured into a deadly trap. The Soviet tanks, once cautious, now burned fuel at a frantic pace, advancing too fast, too deep, without adequate protection from their infantry and artillery. The Soviet doctrine of operation in depth, which aimed at rapid penetration and disorganization of the enemy rearguard, was being applied with an excess of zeal that would prove fatal. The armored formations, like sharp spearheads, extended vast distances, creating dangerous salients and exposing their flanks to a counterattack. The speed of the advance, while impressive, was a double-edged sword. While gaining ground, it also stretched supply lines to a critical point. The exhausted Soviet infantry marched tirelessly through the snow and ice, trying to keep up with the frantic pace of the tanks. Many soldiers were ill-equipped for the harsh, Winter and fatigue was beginning to take its toll. Supply lines, already precarious due to damaged infrastructure and the vastness of the territory, were on the verge of collapse. Fuel, ammunition, food and medical supplies arrived late or in insufficient quantities. Trucks, many of them captured from the enemy or improvised, struggled to navigate icy and impassable roads, making resupply a Herculean task. Logistics, the Achilles heel of any advancing army, was being dangerously neglected in the name of speed. The Soviet High Command, however, remained blind to these warning signs. They believed the Wehrmacht was defeated, that its ability to counterattack had been annihilated at Stalingrad. Soviet intelligence, perhaps influenced by general optimism, failed to identify Manstein's true intentions. Reports of German troop concentrations on the flanks were downplayed or ignored. The arrogance of victory had clouded their judgment, and caution had been replaced by overconfidence. They saw what they wanted to see, an enemy in retreat, not a cunning predator waiting for the right moment to bite. Soviet generals like Golikov were more concerned with achieving ambitious geographic objectives than with consolidating their positions or protecting their vulnerabilities. The idea that the Germans could orchestrate a maneuver as complex and dangerous as Manstein's seemed unthinkable. They believed the strategic initiative was firmly in their hands, and that the Russian winter, which had been their ally at Stalingrad, would continue to plague the Germans. Little did they know that winter and the landscape itself would be complicit in the trap that tightened with every step their armies took. With every meter of advance, the German pincer tightened, and the bloody fate of the Soviet armies was about to unfold with unimaginable brutality. The boat, the explosion of fury and steel on the ice. February 19, 1943, dawned with a deceptive stillness over the vast, snow-covered plains. The freezing, biting air seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself sensed the carnage that was about to unfold. The Soviet soldiers, exhausted but confident in their advance, perhaps dreamed of the next city to be liberated, of the end of the war that seemed so near. Little did they know that they were on the brink of a frozen hell, about to be engulfed by a storm of steel and fire, orchestrated by Manstein's dark genius. It was on that day, with the precision of a deadly clock, that Manstein gave the order. The signal was transmitted through the German lines, and the response was immediate and devastating. The armored divisions, the feared panzers of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS, which had been hidden and lying in wait, launched their offensive with a speed and brutality that the Soviets simply could not process. It was as if the entire winter had exploded in a pent-up fury, unleashing a torrent of German tanks, artillery, and soldiers surging from all sides, tearing through the Soviet lines with unprecedented violence. The attack was not a frontal assault, but a series of surgical strikes on the exposed flanks of the Soviet armies. The panzers, with their thundering guns and crushing tracks, advanced like hammers, crushing the infantry units and transport vehicles that stretched out in long, vulnerable columns. The surprise was total. The Soviets, accustomed to being the hunters, suddenly found themselves the hunted, caught in a trap that was closing inexorably. The sound of German tank engines, the roar of artillery, and the screams of soldiers blended into a symphony of horror that echoed across the frozen steppes. The Soviet vanguard units, which had advanced so deeply, were the first to feel the full impact of the counterattack. Their flanks, once considered secure, were crushed with relentless ferocity. Soviet tanks, many without fuel or adequate ammunition, were destroyed in a matter of minutes, turning into pyres of twisted metal on the ice. Entire infantry units were surrounded and annihilated, their soldiers slaughtered as they desperately tried to find cover in the desolate landscape. What had been a triumphant advance turned, in the blink of an eye, into a collective panic, a desperate race for survival. On the icy roads, Soviet supply trucks, struggling to keep the front lines supplied, were ambushed and destroyed. German artillery fire and Luftwaffe airstrikes turned supply routes into graveyards of vehicles and men. The Soviet rearguard, which was supposed to be the backbone of the advance, was cut off, cutting off the frontline units from any reinforcements or supplies. The Soviet chain of command collapsed, with communications being disrupted and orders lost in the chaos of battle. General Golikov, who had previously celebrated the advance, now faced the harsh reality of impending disaster. There was no time for organized defensive maneuvers. There was no time for a strategic retreat. There was only fire, steel, and death. Manstein's trap had snapped shut, and the once confident Soviet armies were now locked in a deadly embrace. The illusion of a German retreat had dissipated, revealing the brutal truth. They were no longer marching to victory, but rather to a new massacre in the east, a bloody chapter orchestrated by the cold and calculating mind of Erich von Manstein. The siege, the deadly embrace, and the icy despair. With the German offensive in full swing, what had been a triumphant Soviet advance quickly turned into a nightmare of encirclement and annihilation. Manstein's armored divisions, operating with impressive speed and coordination, closed in on the Soviet forces that had advanced deep into enemy territory. The German pincer, composed of SS and Wehrmacht panzers, closed inexorably, turning vast areas into cauldrons of death and despair. Suddenly, the Soviet troops realized they were surrounded, trapped in a seemingly inescapable trap. The flanks, which had previously seemed secure, had been crushed with overwhelming brutality. Entire units were cut off from the rear, isolated and without hope of reinforcements or supplies. Panic quickly spread through the Soviet ranks. Soldiers, once full of confidence, now ran in desperation, trying to find a break in the tightening encirclement. But the discipline and ferocity of the German attack were relentless. Escape routes were blocked by columns of German tanks and infantry, and any attempt to break out of the encirclement was met with a barrage of artillery and machine gun fire. Soviet communications were the first to collapse under the impact of the counterattack. Soviet General Golikov, desperately trying to respond to the catastrophe, sent orders by radio, but many of them never reached their destination. Telephone lines were cut, radios destroyed or silenced by enemy fire. Divisions were isolated, operating without coordination, unaware of the extent of the disaster surrounding them. In many units, officers had been killed in the first minutes of the attack, leaving the soldiers leaderless and directionless, plunged into indescribable chaos. Wrecked trucks on icy roads, bodies of Soviet soldiers strewn across the snow, burning tanks illuminating the bleak landscape. This was the new reality at the front. What had once been a swift and confident advance was now a desperate struggle for survival, a losing battle against an enemy that had proven far more cunning and dangerous than anyone had imagined. The illusion of a German retreat had shattered, revealing the brutal truth. The Wehrmacht was not in retreat, but rather executing one of the most brilliant and deadly encirclement maneuvers of the war. There was no time for complex tactical maneuvers. There was no time to organize an orderly retreat. There was only fire, steel, and death. Winter, which had previously seemed like a Soviet ally, now became an accomplice in Manstein's trap, with the intense cold and deep snow, making any attempt at escape or resistance even more difficult. The Soviet troops were trapped, and the fate of thousands of men was sealed in the ice and snow of the Russian winter, victims of the tactical genius of one of Nazi Germany's greatest strategists. Aftermath: the new massacre in the east and Manstein's legacy. The Battle of Kharkov, or the Third Battle of Kharkov as it became known, was a devastating blow to the Red Army, a brutal setback that shattered the post-Stalingrad euphoria and exposed the vulnerabilities of an overconfident Soviet command. Manstein's maneuver, with its false retreat and subsequent counterattack, resulted in a new massacre in the east, with tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were equally catastrophic, with hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles destroyed or abandoned in the snow. The psychological impact of the defeat was immense. The belief that the Wehrmacht was in total collapse was shattered, and the reality that the enemy still possessed a lethal counterattack capability was bloodily imposed. Manstein's victory not only stabilized the German southern front, but also restored the morale of the Wehrmacht troops, who had been severely battered at Stalingrad. Manstein's ability to turn a strategic disadvantage into a crushing tactical victory cemented his reputation as one of the greatest commanders of the war. For the Soviets, the defeat at Kharkov was a bitter but necessary lesson. It forced the High Command to re-evaluate its tactics and adopt a more cautious and pragmatic approach. The importance of logistics, flank protection, and coordination between different arms was painfully learned. Although the Soviet Union possessed vast human and material resources, the loss of so many men and equipment in a single battle was a grim reminder of the cost of recklessness. From then on, the Red Army, while still prone to large-scale offensives, would operate with greater attention to tactical detail and the security of its supply lines. Manstein's hook did not change the overall course of the war in the East, which would continue to be a brutal struggle of attrition, but it demonstrated the Wehrmacht's ability to inflict devastating blows, even when outnumbered. The victory at Kharkov allowed the Germans to consolidate their positions and prepare the ground for the next major offensive, the Battle of Kursk, which would occur months later. However, the strategic initiative in the East had definitively passed into Soviet hands, and Manstein's victory, though brilliant, was a last gasp of a war machine that was inexorably being crushed by the vastness of Soviet power and the relentless determination of its people. Manstein's legacy in World War II is complex. Renowned for his tactical genius, he was also a general who served a genocidal regime. His maneuver in Kharkov is still studied in military academies today as a classic example of counterattack and mobile warfare. But for the thousands of Soviet soldiers who perished in the ice and snow, victims of his trap, Manstein's hook was nothing short of a nightmare, a symbol of the brutality and cunning of an enemy that even in retreat was capable of biting with deadly ferocity. The snow that covered the corpses in Kharkov was a shroud for the Soviet illusion of an easy victory and a silent monument to the bloody genius of one of the greatest strategists in military history. The counterattack begins. Ice, fire, and the German fury. Introduction: The Awakening of the Nightmare, February 19, 1943. The white expanse of the Eastern Front, once a scene of seemingly unstoppable Soviet advance, was suddenly rent by a roar that was not the icy wind, but the roar of tank engines and the distant rumble of artillery. What began as isolated sounds, harbingers of a threat not yet understood, transformed in a matter of hours into a full-scale nightmare. Manstein's counterattack, the maneuver he had orchestrated with the coolness of a surgeon and the cunning of a predator, had begun. For a brief, terrifying instant, the Eastern Front seemed to hold its breath, aware that something monumental and bloody was about to unfold. German strength, the return of the war machine. The storm of steel fell furiously on the Soviet flanks, unprotected and stretched out like a hungry wolf pouncing on its prey. There was no warning, no mercy, no pause. It was the return of the German war machine in its most organized, most efficient, most lethal form. The panzers, which had been carefully regrouped and re-equipped, emerged from the fog and snow like ghosts in formation, their imposing silhouettes announcing impending doom. The feared Tiger Is, with their 88mm cannons, roared with precise fire, destroying the Soviet T-34 tanks with single shots, delivered with surgical precision that bordered on the unbelievable. Each explosion sent up columns of fire and ice, mixing the melting snow with chunks of twisted metal and human flesh. It was literally ice and fire, a hellish landscape where the pristine white of winter was quickly dyed a vivid bloody red. The offensive came like a hurricane, converging from north and south on the scattered Soviet columns, which in their haste to advance had made themselves vulnerable. The veteran and battle-hardened German infantry followed closely behind the tanks, like trained war dogs, clearing trenches, storming positions, and firing without a hesitation. The coordination between tanks and infantry was exemplary, a testament to the lightning war doctrine the Wehrmacht had perfected. The Soviets, overstretched, poorly positioned, and above all unprepared for a counterattack of such magnitude, were caught completely by surprise. The illusion of a disorderly retreat had been shattered, revealing the brutal reality of an enemy that, even wounded, was still capable of delivering devastating blows. Soviet chaos, despair, and annihilation. Chaos gripped the Soviet ranks with terrifying speed. Radios were silenced, officers were killed in the first minutes of the attack, units were separated and isolated. The Soviet chain of command disintegrated under the pressure of the German assault. Many Soviet soldiers, who moments before had marched with the certainty of victory, now desperately tried to retreat, but retreat to where? They were surrounded, trapped in a deadly embrace of steel and fire. The ice beneath their feet offered no shelter, only the certainty that annihilation was inevitable. The landscape, once an ally in the advance, now became a scene of despair, with the deep snow and biting cold hindering any attempt at escape or organized resistance. Some, in an act of desperate bravery, tried to resist, digging positions in the frozen snow, setting up anti-tank guns that barely worked in the extreme cold. But the German attacks came in crushing waves, one after another, relentless, and behind each wave came more tanks, more infantry, more death. Isolated resistance was quickly suppressed by German tactical superiority and firepower. What had once been an orderly advance was now a disorganized mass of men and machines, easy prey for the German fury. The role of the Luftwaffe, the return of the Steel Falcons. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, which had been largely absent from the skies of the Eastern Front since the catastrophe of Stalingrad, reappeared with renewed ferocity. Its once scarce bombers and fighter bombers now dominated the airspace, attacking retreating Soviet columns and supply routes. Icy roads became death traps, with trucks bursting into flames, tanks being fired upon from above, and the hope of victory disappearing into smoke. The presence of the Luftwaffe added a new dimension of terror to the inferno on the ground, turning any attempt to regroup or escape into suicide. The sound of German plane engines, once a portent of destruction, now assured them that there was nowhere to run, no place to hide from the fury pouring from the sky. The battle scenario, the choreographed carnage. The ground, once white and untouched by snow, was now stained red, stained with the blood of thousands of men. The landscape transformed into a scene of indescribable carnage. Men screamed, unsure of where to run, their cries drowned out by the roar of tanks and the thunder of artillery. A Soviet soldier, his intestines exposed, desperately tried to contain them with his hands, while another, legless, screamed his mother's name in an agonizing wail. Soviet tanks exploded one after another, transforming into gigantic torches on the frozen field, illuminating the darkness with the light of destruction. It was a choreographed carnage, a macabre ballet of death and despair, where every German movement was precise and every Soviet life a sacrifice. And in the midst of this hell, the SS commanders, dark and ruthless figures, smiled. For them, this was not just a battle, it was justice, revenge for the humiliation of Stalingrad, the restored reputation of a force that had been underestimated. The brutality of the attack reflected the ideology that drove them, a mixture of fanaticism and an unshakable belief in the superiority of their race and their war machine. The Red Army, which had advanced so confidently, was being torn apart, its units disintegrated, its men annihilated. The sight of their panicked enemies running in despair was confirmation of their own strength and validation of the ruthlessness that defined them. The immediate impact, the reversal and the wait for Kharkov. Manstein, at his headquarters, watched the offensive unfold on maps, listening to reports of his units advancing faster than expected. The satisfaction in his voice was palpable. Within days, the weeks-long Soviet advance had been wiped off the map as if it had never existed. The front line, which had stretched dangerously eastward, was now rapidly retreating with the Soviets outnumbered and on the run. Manstein's maneuver not only halted the Soviet advance, but spectacularly reversed it, restoring the initiative to the Wehrmacht in the southern sector of the Eastern Front. And Kharkov, the great city to the north, which had been a crucial Soviet objective, waited. It waited for the next stage of Manstein's plan. It waited for the final blow. The city, which had changed hands several times, was about to become the stage for another bloody and decisive chapter of the war, a testament to Manstein's tactical genius and the relentless brutality of the conflict in the East. Victory at Kharkov would not only be a tactical victory, but a symbol of the German ability to recover and counterattack, even in the most adverse conditions. Soviet visions shattered. The price of Manstein's trap. Introduction. The beginning of the collapse. What began as a coordinated counterattack, orchestrated with the coldness and precision of a surgeon, quickly transformed into a spectacle of mass destruction. The storm of ice and blood that descended upon the Eastern Front spared no one. In the midst of this Teutonic fury, the Soviet divisions, once so confident in their advance, began to crumble, literally. The illusion of an easy victory disintegrated under the weight of the German panzers and the relentless infantry, revealing the brutal reality of a trap that was inexorably closing. The collapse, the disintegration of formations. Those formations that had advanced, confidently days before, conquering city after city, were now being decimated in the open. The rapid, unprotected advance had turned Soviet units into easy targets. Entire troops were isolated, surrounded, and annihilated in frozen pockets. Without supplies, without reinforcements, without a way out. It was total collapse, a mass disintegration that spread like a plague across the front line. Discipline and cohesion, once hallmarks of the Red Army, gave way to panic and disorder. What remained of the Soviet divisions was ground down like wheat by steel reapers, transforming the landscape into a vast graveyard of men and machines. Golikov's despair, fragmented reports, and the absence of support. Soviet General Golikov, from his headquarters, watched in astonishment as the catastrophe unfolded before his eyes. The 40th, 69th and 3rd Tank Divisions, which had been the spearhead of the Soviet advance, were being dismembered, pulverized by the German fury. The reports that arrived were fragmented, chaotic, often hastily written, blood-stained and hand-scrawled by messengers who would die before finishing them. Desperate messages like, "We are surrounded, we need air support, out of ammunition, troops in panic, and tanks lost." Retreating in disarray reached his ears, but there was no support. There was no saving anyone. The Red Army had fallen into the trap, and now it was being mercilessly crushed. German efficiency, the encirclement and spray tactics, as chaos descended. On the Soviet ranks, the Germans operated with almost mechanical precision. Soviet tanks, abandoned or in flames, piled up in heaps, creating fields of twisted metal carcasses and charred bodies. German tactics were surgical. When a pocket of Soviet resistance appeared, it was not directly engaged in frontal combat. Instead, it was quickly surrounded, cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or escape, and then pulverized with heavy artillery or concentrated fire from tanks and machine guns. Each explosion seemed to mark the end of a unit. Each machine gun burst silenced a victory song the Soviets had begun to sing at Stalingrad. The brutal efficiency of this tactic minimized German losses and maximized enemy annihilation. The brutality of the SS, the shadow of Totenkopf. In many sectors, the German pressure was so overwhelming that Soviet soldiers simply threw down their weapons and ran, desperately seeking escape. Some were shot in the back, others tried to hide in abandoned houses or frozen woods, only to be mercilessly hunted by SS patrols, who were unforgiving. The Totenkopf division, with its dark name and even darker practices, was particularly notorious. To them, Soviet soldiers were not enemies to be captured, but targets to be eliminated. Summary executions became commonplace, and wounded soldiers were finished off with bayonets, transforming battlefields into open cemeteries, without names, without crosses, just silent testimony to barbarity. The German Renaissance, renewed confidence, and the Kharkov target. As the Soviets fled in panic or died in silence, German radios thundered with renewed confidence. The word Sieg, victory, was once again used in communiqué, a sound that had been muffled by the catastrophe of Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht, humiliated and wounded, was reborn from the ice as a vengeful monster, its morale restored by the brutality and effectiveness of Manstein's counterattack. The Soviet divisions were not just being defeated. They were being wiped off the map, their forces disintegrated, and their offensive capability annihilated. And on the horizon, shrouded in winter fog, Kharkov, the strategic city that had been the primary objective of the Soviet advance, was once again the target. The eyes of the German troops now turned to it, no longer as an objective to be defended, but as a prize to be recaptured. The recapture of Kharkov would be the crowning achievement of Manstein's brilliant maneuver, a symbol of German resilience and a bloody reminder that the war in the East was far from over. The city awaited, and with it, the next stage of a relentless conflict. Panzers on the rampage, the siege closes in on Kharkov. The ground was shaking. It wasn't the cold nor the biting east wind. It was the deafening roar of the panzers, tearing through the frozen fields of Ukraine towards Kharkov. Like thirsty predators, the Wehrmacht's armored divisions advanced with almost choreographed precision, a symphony of steel, oil, and death. At the forefront of the offensive were Eos Temidos Panzer IV, Tigres et Sturmgeschütz, crushing everything in its path. With the support of motorized units and highly trained infantry, the siege of the city was taking shape, swift and deadly. Kharkov, with its heavy buildings and wide streets, was perfect for urban defense. But the Soviets were exhausted. Their lines were broken, their reserves depleted. The city, instead of a bastion, began to become a trap. The German tanks moved in a pincer movement, closing in with brutal efficiency. The strategy was clear: cut off all supply routes, isolate the defenders, and crush them mercilessly. It was a replay of Stalingrad in reverse. But now, the Germans were the ones encircling, and the Soviets were the ones begging for reinforcements. Hauser and Hoth's troops showed no hesitation. They wanted Kharkov back, and they wanted blood. The skies, heavy with dark clouds, trembled with the roar of the Stukas. The dive bombings began before dawn and continued into the night. Each raid rained fire on the city's industrial districts and working-class neighborhoods, indiscriminately killing soldiers and civilians. The population, most had fled, but many remained. Now, they watched helplessly as the collapse took place. Churches crumbled under direct impact. Avenues turned into craters. The sound of German artillery was constant, like a hammer hitting raw flesh. Kharkov city, Soviet troops entrenched themselves in buildings, schools, even hospitals. They dug holes in the frozen streets, turning every corner into a death zone. But the advantage lay on the other side. The Germans were motivated, supplied, and led by commanders thirsty for revenge. The city, already destroyed by the previous war, began to rot again, overcome by smoke, cold, and the smell of bodies piled up in basements and corridors. It was the prelude to the final storm. Kharkov was surrounded, and hell had not yet begun. Street fighting, every block in blood. Kharkov was no longer a city. It was a chaotic, ruined battlefield where the silence of the snow was broken by gunfire, explosions, and screams of agony. Every block, every house, every ruin became the scene of a bloody and merciless confrontation. Exhausted and starving, Soviet soldiers turned what remained of the city into a makeshift fortress. Entrenched in bombed-out buildings, they fired machine guns through shattered windows, hurled grenades from beneath rubble, and fought hand-to-hand in the dark corridors. But the enemy was no less fierce. The SS divisions advanced with brutal determination, clearing the streets with flamethrowers, heavy machine guns, and grenades. They gave no respite. Each conquered house was taken with blood, and victory was measured in piled-up bodies. The sound of incessant gunfire echoed through the icy streets. Explosions tore down walls, sending up clouds of dust and smoke that mingled with the falling snow. In the squares, German tanks attempted to break through the Soviet lines, firing their cannons and smashing improvised barricades. The Soviets responded with rocket launchers and anti-tank rifles, in desperate battles that often ended with soldiers leaping from tank to tank, fighting hand to hand. The smell of gunpowder, blood, and death was omnipresent. Amid the chaos, shouts of command mingled with the wails of the wounded and desperate orders. Many Soviet soldiers fought to their last breath, knowing there was no hope of reinforcements. The streets became a deadly maze, where every corner could be the last. In the makeshift trenches and rubble, the cold cut to the bone, but the heat of the battle was stifling. The ice was beginning to turn red. Civilians who still remained, hiding in basements or fleeing through alleys, were tragically caught in the crossfire. The war spared no innocents. Kharkov was becoming hell on earth. And as the fighting intensified, the line between life and death disappeared. There, only survival remained. At the cost of the blood spilled on every square meter of that ruined city. Executions and atrocities, civilians in the crossfire, in the whirlwind of gunfire, explosions and screams, the line separating soldiers and civilians in Kharkov dissolved. For many residents who didn't have time to flee, the war became a cruel and merciless death sentence. German troops, especially SS divisions, were known for their relentless brutality. In the destroyed streets and dark alleys, many civilians were captured, accused of collaborating with the Soviets, or simply condemned for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Summary executions occurred frequently, with men, women, and even children shot or bayoneted to death. Entire families disappeared, and the city's silence was sometimes broken only by the sound of gunshots echoing through the snow. On the other hand, some Soviets, fearing infiltration and betrayal, reacted with equal severity, treating anyone suspected with extreme harshness. Paranoia and fear turned Kharkov into a cauldron of distrust, where even neighbors turned against each other. The suffering of civilians was exacerbated by shortages of food, heat, and medical care. Untreated wounded died slowly in cellars or ruins, while winter mercilessly punished all those trapped in the crossfire. Amidst this desolate landscape, the streets became open cemeteries, silent witnesses to human barbarity. The Battle of Kharkov was not just a clash of armies, but a massacre where the price of war was paid in innocent blood. The siege breaks. Desperate Soviet escape. After days of fierce fighting and a relentless siege, the inexorable German pressure began to take its toll. The Soviet lines, exhausted and shattered, could no longer withstand the weight of the armored offensive and the incessant fire. In Kharkov, the situation was becoming critical. The Soviets tried to hold their positions, but the pressure from the Panzer divisions was overwhelming. Then, under orders from high command, the difficult decision came: immediate withdrawal to save what was left of the army. But escaping was not simple. The roads, already clogged with snow and debris, were clogged with endless columns of soldiers, broken tanks, and damaged vehicles. Chaos ensued. The Soviets, desperate, tried to break the encirclement while the German forces closed in, attacking from the sides and cutting off escape routes. What was supposed to be an orderly retreat turned into a chaotic escape, marked by gunfire, explosions, and fear. Many soldiers lost their weapons, equipment, and even hope. Tanks got stuck in the ice, trucks were destroyed by air raids and ambushes, and endless lines of men tried to escape German fire. In the midst of this confusion, discipline broke down. Soldiers, officers, entire units were isolated and massacred. Night fell heavily over the fields covered in blood-stained snow. Thousands of Soviet soldiers perished in that desperate escape, which turned into a veritable bloodbath. Kharkov, which months earlier had seemed like a trophy in the Red Offensive, now became a symbol of the cruelty of war, where death had returned in the winter. Consequences and lessons of the battle. When the smoke finally settled over the frozen fields around Kharkov, the toll was terrifying. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The initial victory had turned into one of the Red Army's most brutal defeats that winter. The Battle of Kharkov starkly demonstrated that the war in the East was not simply a matter of numbers or morale. It was a struggle of intelligence, logistics, and patience. Manstein, with his surgical plan, had demonstrated that even a wounded army could turn the tide with strategy and boldness. For the Soviets, the lesson was harsh. One cannot underestimate the enemy, nor advance without adequate protection on the flanks. The swift and triumphant Stalingrad offensive, though inspiring, could not be repeated. Mechanically, winter and the terrain demanded respect and caution. The battle also highlighted the importance of armored forces and coordination between tanks, infantry, and artillery, as well as the need to maintain secure supply lines and effective communication. On a human level, Kharkov left profound scars. Thousands of Soviet families mourned their dead and missing. The war showed its cruelest and most relentless face, where death returned in winter, cold and inexorable. But despite the defeat, the fight continued. The Battle of Kharkov was a bloody yet pivotal chapter in the long and brutal war between the Reich and the Soviet Union. And while snow covered the bodies, the flame of Soviet resistance never died out. The Battle of Kharkov wasn't just a fight for a city. It was a duel between survival and annihilation, between hope and despair. In the midst of a cruel winter, where the cold seemed to freeze even the soul, death returned with more fury, more steel, and more blood. The lessons of that confrontation echoed throughout the Eastern Front. The fallen heroes and anonymous victims of the battle reminded the world that war is, first and foremost, a game of strategy and endurance, but also an endless human tragedy. Kharkov became a symbol of the courage, sacrifice, and brutality of a war that spared no one, not soldiers, not civilians, not even time itself. And even in the darkest hours, the flame of Soviet hope never went out, because in war, winter may return with a death, but the will to fight always returns stronger. If you were impressed by the brutality and strategy of the Battle of Kharkov, please like and share this video so more people can learn about this epic story of World War II. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos about the bloodiest and most decisive battles of the conflict. And leave a comment. Which battle do you want us to explore next? Your suggestion could become our next content. Thanks for watching this far. Warrior, the story continues, and together we'll uncover each chapter of this relentless war.